Now, the reason Namibia is in large letters and Botswana and Zimbabwe in slightly smaller letters is because we spent the majority of our time in Namibia. And I'd like to start off with giving you some idea of where we were and what we were about. So Namibia is in the southern tip of Africa, and it's in an area that's referred to as Southern Africa. And the bird books for that area are called Southern Africa. So they include South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, and often also Zambia. So those are all covered in one book. And if you look at the latitude of this area, it's a latitude very similar to that of Mexico. So central Mexico, Yucatan area would be sort of central Namibia. And I wanted to give you an idea of the relative size of this country because we drove the whole time. We started in Windhoek, which is almost the center of the country. And this would be equivalent to an area, the north of Namibia, equivalent to Prince Rupert, and the south down southern Oregon border. So that would give you an idea of the distances that one is covering. Now, we flew from Johannesburg into Windhoek, and it's about an 1.5-hour flight, and stayed at a place called the River Crossing Lodge. It's in the west, or sorry, in the east of Windhoek in the hills overlooking it, and a very nice place to stay. Now, one thing to remember about this area is that it's fairly high altitude. And here from the River Crossing Lodge, we're looking down on Windhoek and behind the hills in the background here. And Windhoek's population is about 300,000. And its elevation is about the same as Denver. So it's about 1 mile high in actual elevation. Now, it makes a difference in this area of Africa because you're at fairly high elevation. And I put this in, and I've used it previously in the slide to show you the difference between this area of Africa, the Southern Africa area, and North America. The fact that most of the land is fairly high elevation. And in fact, an awful lot of the land that we traveled in was probably above 800 meters. And much of it was in above 1,500 meters. So from the river crossing in, we made a 3-day trip down into the bottom left corner here, Susafly, and the dunes area of Namibia. And I think that a trip to Namibia should always include the dunes because Namibia is known for its deserts. And it's really quite a spectacular area in many different ways. You see masses of sand like this. It's called a sand sea, and it runs in from the coast. And I thought these were just big piles of sand, but in fact, they're not just big piles of sand. What they are hills that are buried in sand. So in fact, there is some structure underneath them. We climbed the ridge on Big Daddy, and this is the same picture on the left, and then essentially skied down on our bare feet the slopes down into the pan here, which is called Deadfly, and it's a well-known place to visit. The trees in this area are skeletal, most of them, and thousands of years old. There's not very much there. It's a dry pan from water flowing in the past, but these days it's just a dry, very hot area. Surprisingly, there was a crow with 2 nestlings in one of these dead trees. So the pied crow, and I think we saw also one flycatcher and not very much else. But in the parking area, interestingly, there were lots of Cape sparrows. And these Cape sparrows would congregate the moment a vehicle came in and stopped in the parking area, and they'd zip in underneath it as soon as the vehicle was stopped. And what they were doing was getting the water that was dripping off the condensers of the air conditioning. And they've learned this behavior and have been quite capable of surviving in this very dry area devoid really of any water. Most of the water that they get will come from condensation that occurs overnight, because there are often nighttime winds and mists come in from the ocean side to bring virtually the only moisture that comes into these deserts. It's an area known for its sunsets, and this is looking towards the west, towards the setting sun. And if you turn around and look in the other direction, you'll see something a little different. And these spectacles in the sunsets are almost every night, really quite spectacular. So after spending 2 nights down in the desert area, we returned to our motel at the River Crossing Lodge. And we had another couple of days before our Rockjumper guide joined us. And he joined us with a 4-wheel drive diesel Toyota SUV. And that was to be our vehicle for the next 18 days as we crossed the area. So the first morning we left and headed just to the west of Windhoek to a game reserve. It's very close. So if you end up in Windhoek and you want to visit a game reserve, that's less than an hour's drive or half an hour's drive. And then we went south towards the Namibians guest farm. So we'll start in the road headed out. It didn't take long for Gareth to spot a jackal and spotted flycatcher, and in this case, yellow-billed, southern yellow-billed hornbill. He had an incredible knack for seeing things even when he was the driver and keeping his eye on the road. This is the game park, and on the right-hand side is pale-winged starling. And the pale-winged, I'm gonna just change the view here if I can, because I'm losing part of my screen. Shoot, I have to do it. No. No, can't. Okay. So the pale-winged starling was carrying nesting material, and some of the birds were still nesting at this time, which was February, mid-February. And there were lots of different small birds and larger birds present in the game reserve. And also in the game reserve, you would see things like dung on the road. And of course, they're going to be the dung beetles pushing little balls of dung over to the side of the road, finding a place to deposit and lay their eggs. And I don't know if you realize that the dung beetle pushes with its hind legs, its front legs on the ground, and its hind legs rolling the ball of dung as it heads towards wherever it's going. In this particular instance, I think he had a long way to go across the full paved road. If he'd gone in the other direction, he would have been at the edge immediately. There were also some reptiles and lots of game animals as well, and ostrich. We headed out after spending a couple of hours in the game park. We headed south and just looking for a little bit of vegetation on the roadside, but it's mostly dry land. We stopped for a little bit and were able to turn up this black-chested prinia, the brew in the center, and the male and female Purrit batus. These are small birds that you see along the roadside. And of course, the moment you stop, somebody comes along and wonders what you're up to. Well, we learned with this stop. We were having our packed lunch at that point, and these fellows came along, and Gareth used his packed lunch to provide these fellows with something to eat. We were able to share as well, because the packed lunches were always much more than you could possibly eat, unless you were a starving giant, I guess, and sent them packing on their way with something to eat. They had a sense of humor, obviously. Now, when you're in this area, this is rocky hills right here, but an awful lot of the area is just like this: sand and a little bit of grass if you're lucky. And in that, there are a lot of birds. In this case, we've got the fawn-colored lark and the gray-backed sparrow lark, spike-killed lark, and a slightly larger bird, the double-banded courser. You won't be able to see in this picture, but the spike-killed lark has this very long spike on the back edge of its foot. And if you look in detail, you can see it, and it's probably an inch long. It's quite remarkable. So by the time we got down to Namibia, we'd seen 7 species before we got to the park. At the park, I think the number is 35. And then the road to Namibia, there was another 20. And when we arrived at Namibia, this was a unique place. It's been in operation since the 1940s and is essentially a guest ranch, I guess you'd call it. They have a campground, and they have some camp sites, and some villas that call Klipspringer villas. And we were sent from the reception. They said, well, just head down that way a couple of kilometers and you'll find a place, number 7, and the key will be in the door. So we headed off, and this was what we found when we got to number 7. And what you see is these places just placed in the rocky area, and there's nobody else around, just these structures. And the antennas, or what look like antennas, are actually lightning rods over top of these buildings, because they do get lightning storms that come through. And the small one on the right was accommodation for Gareth, our guide. And the one on the left is actually, or the 2 on the left are actually one building. But this was ours. On the left, the living area, and on the right, the sleeping area. And when you go inside, this is what you see. It's built right into the rocks. The rocks are incorporated into the kitchen, the bedroom, the showers. The shower comes out of a hole in the rock. You can see no sign of wires or pipes or anything. It's quite amazing what this fellow has done in this area. And I think there's 7 of these structures, 7 or 8 of these structures called Klipspringer villas. Quite a remarkable place. It's really mind-boggling. In the upper right is Gareth and I having breakfast on the patio the next morning, and we saw quite a few birds in the yard and around our accommodations before we had breakfast, and then headed out, this time heading towards Walvis Bay and the coast. Now, the first thing you do when we're on the high plateau is you have to go down a pass. And the elevation drop is about 2,500 or 2,800 feet between where we were at Namibia and when you get down to the next level at Solitaire. We were looking for a rare endemic that exists in that area, and Gareth had seen this previous trip into this area. In the general area, he'd seen this bird. It's called a Hoar chat. And so when we went down through Spreet Chute Pass, we went looking, and sure enough, he turned one up in about 10 minutes, and it wasn't just one Hoar chat, but it was actually a pair of them, and they entertained us until we were tired of them, and we then moved on. great photographic opportunities. And in fact, Gareth said it was one of his best photographic opportunities for this particular bird. And along the road, you see things like this. This is a group of white-backed mouse birds. And the story was that they're sunning their bellies in the morning, warming them up to improve their digestion. But I don't know if that's true, but they certainly were strung out facing the sun. The area going north, we crossed the Tropic of Capricorn, and the rest of our trip was actually spent north of the Tropic of Capricorn. It's, as you see behind us, it's a gravel, a few rocks, desert with a little bit of rocky elevation, but very little, and few living animals. On the right is a Rupel's Koran that we saw along the road there. On the left is a Ludwig's bustard, which was actually at Namibia. But I wanted to point out with the Rupel's Koran on the right, we stopped when we saw this on the roadside, and I'd have to say Gareth saw it. We weren't the first to notice it. And when we were looking at it, he said, "What else do you see in the picture?" And of course, what else do we see with our binoculars was not much else, just sand and desert and gravel and this bird standing up there. And he pointed out to us that there was a female in the picture, but it was just lying down beside a little tuft of brush. And he said, whenever you see a Koran or a bustard, there are usually two of them, male and female. And the one that you see will be the male, and the female will be there, but you will have a hard time finding her. And that was in fact true. So that was an interesting lesson. This is another view, just roadside view as we're going by, and there's an ostrich passing, and occasionally you'd see an oryx or an ostrich, not very much, and no other animals. Occasionally a bit of rock structure, and I don't know whether you can see in the foreground of this rock structure, there's actually a tree in this area. And one thing I understand about Namibia is that there is a lot of underground water, almost no surface water. This area has been in, I guess, drought for close to 3 years, very little rain. And then at the time that we were there, which was the wet season, it wasn't very wet, but there was a bit of rain and a few thunder showers that moved through. And when that happens, occasionally dry valleys become running torrents. So we got to Walvis Bay on the coast, and this is the Atlantic coast of Africa. And Walvis Bay is a large open bay, and Walvis is German whale. So I guess in times of whaling, this was a bay where whalers came in or used. So these are large, flat areas, and the big business is salt, and I'll get to that in a minute. But our first morning was an early departure before the sun got up, heading back into the dunes area to try and find a rare endemic dune lark. And the dune lark is known to be in this particular area. And if you're lucky, you might find it. But our first encounter was with a donkey who greeted us as we headed out into the desert. You can see there's not much vegetation here, a few trees and some scrubby grass type structure. And all of this is getting its water from the evening and nighttime mists that come in off the ocean and condense. And so all of the wildlife in this area is very dependent on the ocean breezes that bring this damp structure or fog structure in and condense and provide the moisture. Well, sure enough, just after there was enough light to really see what you were doing, we did hear the dune lark, and after a little bit of looking, were able to encounter this bird. And there were actually several of them, and really a cute little bird. But had you gone later in the day, or even tried any other time other than the crack of dawn, you probably would not have seen this, because they feed early, and after that, they'll head for the shelter and cool places where they can spend some, I guess, reasonable time during the heat of the day. And this is the business in the area of Walvis Bay and Swakopmund, which is just to the north of Walvis Bay. So the Walvis Bay salt holdings, we'd see these trucks go by, big tandem dump trucks piled high with white stuff. Well, the white stuff was salt, and they were harvesting that. The other thing you'll see on the right is Seabird Guano Limited and Richwater Oyster Company. So presumably those are the businesses that exist in this area. This is some of the salt ponds in the Walvis Bay area. Some of them are tinged with color. I don't know whether it's algal or something like that. So some ponds will be white, some will be clear water, others will be tinged slightly. And if you're really lucky, you'll come across something like the chestnut-banded plover with its sort of pinkish band and standing in a pond of pinkish water. So these are some of the smaller birds that existed in the salt ponds, and they're not the only ones. There were lots of them. Common greenshank, black-winged stilt, little stints, and larger birds such as the flamingos, and literally thousands of flamingos. This is fortune catching both a greater and a lesser flamingo walking one after the other. And you can see the difference between the two. The lesser flamingo is more pink in color and has a larger black bill, or more black bill. The greater flamingo has just the black tip on the bill. And from a distance, it's fairly easy to make out the difference between the two. And these are some of the other residents in the area. And the upper right are the large numbers of cormorants that exist in the area. And that's probably the source of the guano that the company harvests. So great white pelican, hard-lipped gull, white-fronted plover with a chick, and the chick in the center, bottom center. It was under the wing of the white-fronted plover parent when we first saw it, and then it skipped out. The pied apposite on the left, you can see the curve of the bill, and the picture on the far left shows you how they skim the water, and obviously the bill is designed for this behavioral posture. Oh, I missed an endemic Damara tern, but just flying by. It just flew by. You got a fleeting glimpse of it. I put this in because the ruddy turnstone is something that we do see occasionally in this area and is in North America as well. This is a banded ruddy turnstone, just feeding on the beach. Not enough detail with the camera to see what was on the band and get any identifying information. So from our 2-day stay in Walvis Bay and Swakopmund, that's a hard word to say, but we headed north and east back up onto the plateau again. And our first stop was a lunch stop at Spitzkop. And it's about 20 or 30 kilometers off the main road. And you can see it from the main road. It's quite a remarkable outcrop of rock. These are granite outcrops, and they become actually a local environment because they trap water, and there are water sources in these. We drove in and found a camp or picnic area where we could have a picnic table and park under a tree and get out of the heat. And there were obviously residents there that expected handouts as well because they come begging. This is a ground squirrel and pale-winged starling. You can see he's looking down at us from the tree above. Mountain wheat here on the sign. Acacia piebald barbet in the tree, and there were a couple of Montero's hornbills that appeared. Now, Montero's hornbill for us was a new bird, another one for our life list. And I think this guy has in his beak, I'm guessing a raisin or something, because we had trail mix in our lunch, packed lunches this day. And I think I threw a piece of trail mix towards the ground squirrel. And this guy snatched it right out of the midair and honked it down. And he was incredibly dexterous with his bill. It surprised me. So we were headed for Orongo Wilderness Lodge, and this is where we would spend the next 2 nights. And I'll give you a walk around this particular picture because it's a little complicated and busy. And the upper left is our cabin. Now, cabin, they're tents, but as you can see in just below that, the picture of the inside, they are very comfortable structures. I guess this is what people call glamping and specialized fancy camping. We had a patio out, our own large patio outside, and from up above there, I took a picture down, and on the far right side, you can see Noreen, and that's the picture I took from above looking down at her. And behind her is a roof structure, and that is the reception area for the lodge. And further to the right is the dining room and swimming pool, and they're pictured in the middle. So I relocated them to the middle. So what I want to warn you about is this is a fabulous place to see wildlife. There are rhinos and all sorts of large animals, and there are scads of birds. And it's about 2.5 hour, maybe 3 hour drive north of Windhoek. And what you have to remember is you have to have your mobility because you're up and down these rocky slopes. You need some stability and some mobility to enjoy what this place has to offer. It has an awful lot to offer. These are some of the birds, just to give you an idea. On the right-hand side is a black-backed puffback with its back puffed up. On the left-hand side is a different bird, but it's the black-backed puffback without the puff on its back. Both of them males, and they have this ability to puff up the feathers on their back, and when they get excited about things, that's one thing that they will do, or if they're in a mating behavior. Green winged patilia in the middle. These guys would come up right by the dining room, probably 6 feet away from you, and feed, because they put some feed out by the dining room. Lower right, red-billed spurfowl, they'd be up in the hills and the rocky slopes above. Rock hyrax, also up in the hills. And in the center is an African paradise flycatcher sitting on a nest. And just to give you a better look at that, that's the male sitting on the nest. And you can see his tail feathers go way out to the left end of the picture. There are 3 young that you can see there. And we actually have pictures of the male and the female on the nest at different times with these young sticking out. It turns out this was their 3rd brood this year. So these African birds in this part of the country can have multiple broods during one season. We were also fortunate to find the pearl-spotted owlet, and part of the reason it's a nice bird to find is because it preys on small birds. And the moment you find it, or you hear it calling, you know that the young or the small birds in the area will all congregate and they try and mob it. It's just the same as crows try and mob the hawks around here when they get upset. Well, because the pearl-spotted owlet does feed on these small birds, they've learned to mob them and make sure everybody knows exactly where he is. Gareth had this uncanny ability to imitate birds, and he could imitate the pearl-spotted owl, and all of a sudden we'd have all sorts of birds coming around us. So it really did make for interesting photography. You had to be fast because these birds are in and out in a flash, but very interesting. I was going to show you another picture of the rosy-fronted lovebird, which is a small parrot. In this picture, you can see one of the nesting areas up on the cliff above us. And they were making such a racket, and we took a picture of them. And it wasn't until later when we looked at the picture and we saw this up above that we realized there was something in the picture. And the something in the picture is, this is probably the head of the black mamba, and it winds all the way around back down to the tail down here. And if you look right here, there's quite a heavy bulge, which is probably a lovebird or chick or something that it has consumed. And the lovebirds that are in the front of the opening here are clearly upset at what was going on. So had they not been yelling the way they were, we probably would not have seen this and taken the picture. And it wasn't until we looked at the picture we actually saw the reason that they were so upset. There were 3 target birds that we were after in this particular area. One was heart-lipped spurfowl, the other white-tailed shrike, and the third one was the rock runner. Now, the white-tailed shrike turned up pretty early on. The rock runner was a little harder to find. It was up on the hillsides, and you would see it in the distance, hear it calling. But heart-lipped spurfowl kept calling, and we could not find it until the morning before we were leaving. Just before breakfast, we heard them right outside on our patio of our tent, and couldn't find it, and then down to the road, and sure enough, we saw one just fleetingly on the road down there. So we decided that it was a sighting, it was good enough, and it was time to have breakfast and get on the road. So we got loaded up and headed out, and there's quite a rocky gully that you go down coming from the lodge, and we stopped at the top of it just to, I think Gareth was programming the GPS for our next destination. And as we stopped, a heart-lipped spurfowl started calling, and another one calling back to it. And to make a long story short, we got some great pictures of heart-lipped spurfowl. A white-tailed shrike at the same time came out on the other side of the road, and there were 2 adults, and they were feeding, and the rock runner was up on the rock just above us calling as well. So the 3 species we've gone to try and get in this lodge all sort of gave us a send-off as we headed north to the next lodge. So heading north, we were headed for Etosha National Park, and this is the world famous destination. Most people will have heard of Etosha. Along the road, we encountered these clouds of birds in the upper right, and on the road itself and along the side of the road were these storks, and there were a large number of them, and they were obviously feeding on roadkill. And the roadkill was this bug that you see in the lower right, which is called a corn cricket. And I think you can see the size is 5 centimeters or about 2 inches long. These are quite sizable, and so a tasty meal for these guys. But when you're driving down the highway at 100 kilometers an hour and one comes into your windshield, it's a shocker. And in fact, it created a star in the windshield of the vehicle. They're quite a heavy bug, and when they hit, it's like somebody threw a rock at you. It's quite surprising. This is the Abdom stork, which is the group. And we saw them also in Etosha and other spots in large groups, again, feeding on the corn cricket. So this is the Etosha area where we spent a total of 5 nights, 2 nights in the Okakujo camp on the left-hand side, 1 night at Halali camp in the center, and the 4th and the 5th nights we spent at Onguma Bush Lodge, which is actually outside of the park, and but just on the boundary. So Okakujo and Halali and Namatoni are are government lodges within the park, and they have accommodations and facilities, and they are perfectly adequate, but somewhat basic, I would say. Not so with Anguma Bush Lodge. So the first day we went north up along the left-hand side of Etosha Pan. Now the blue color in the Etosha Pan shouldn't be blue because it's really white. It is dry salt pans. And normally this whole area is dry and dusty, but that turned out not to be the case when we were there. They've had essentially a 3-year drought, and we were there in the wet season, and it was actually wet for the first time in 3 years. There were rivers running that had never run in the past 2 years. This is in Okukujo camp. The vehicle on the left is waiting to get out the gate. The whole of Etosha is closed to the public from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. And at 6 a.m. they open the gates and you can go out and you have 12 hours and the animals have the other 12 hours to themselves. So we headed north up the area, and the first thing that's surprising about this photo is there's green grass. And that was in fact a real surprise because the last few times that Gareth has been in Etosha, it has been a dry dust bowl. There are lots of large animals in the area. Most of you will recognize large animals. This is a giraffe not browsing on the top of the trees as usual, but actually taking advantage of all the grass and the wildflowers. And in order to get down to it, he has to spread his front legs, the same way they get down to water when they want to drink. And in this position, they're quite vulnerable because they can't move nearly as fast as when they're standing upright. So they're vulnerable to predators in that particular position. And there were other, obviously, predators and other game animals. So top center is a black-backed jackal. Upper left is a spotted hyena. Of course, you recognize the zebra on the right. Lower right, springbok and calf, and lion and lioness, and the giraffe on the far left. And this picture is looking out at the pan, and you see some blue color, and that is actually water. So one has to keep in mind that this is not the norm, and you see all the grass in the foreground. These are oryx and an ostrich on the edge. And what we were looking for was the small birds that came in to this grassy area and were often found in this area close to the pans. We stopped to see an African pipit, and looking closely, there were a couple of pink-billed larks, and then moving on, red-capped lark and an eastern clapper lark. There were also Sabota larks and a variety of other larks in the area. There were also birds such as the rufous-eared warbler in the upper right, the desert cisticola on the lower and the upper left, the battler, which is about the size of our eagle, our bald eagle, very short-tailed and maybe an inch or two shorter wingspan, but essentially in the same size class, a very elegant bird. And of course, the ostrich. On the lower left is the crowned lapwing. This is plover family, and there were 3 or 4 species of lapwing that we actually saw in this area. And on the right is the white-quilled bustard, or also known as the black coran, same bird. These guys were quite vocal wherever you saw them. We saw very few females, but they were there, just harder to see. And obviously wildflowers with all that rain and lots of insects. So the European bee eaters were happy. This is their wintertime residence is down south. And on the right, this flower, I didn't know what it was, and I asked and didn't know until I got home and used iNaturalist and took a glimpse of this picture with iNaturalist, put it out, and somebody from Namibia came back and said, oh, that's the black sesame. And this is a black sesame flower, and apparently it's grown as a crop in some areas of Africa. And I'm sure some of you have bought black sesame seeds. Well, this is the plant that produces them. And there were interesting birds with long tails. This is the shaft-tailed whydah. There are actually 4 different species of whydah that we saw. Shaft-tail, the pintail, the long-tailed paradise, and the broad-tailed, all different tail assemblages in the breeding plumage. And vocal individuals such as the rufous nape lark here, and Sabota lark, and the monotonous lark, which is a lark that you would hear with the same monotonous call all the time, but often was away from the road. But we were lucky that one came in close and we were able to get some good pictures as well. And of course, rollers. These are very interesting bird that you see. There's a European roller, and in this case, this is the lilac-breasted roller, and Noreen caught this particular picture with one coming into land beside another one. And the one that's landing has obviously got something in its beak, and it looks like a corn cricket to me. So this is the lilac-breasted roller. Great pictures of these birds, but you really need to get them with their wings out to get the full flavor of the bird. This is the Nguma bush camp that we stayed 2 nights in on the east side of Etosha. Very nice accommodations with elegant dining, and I think our hut is lower right, and in the center is crimson-breasted bush shrike. There were lots of birds around the property, including pearl-spotted owlet, which allowed us to again accumulate a lot of small birds. In the area around Fisher's Pan, there were thousands and thousands of red-billed quelea. Now you see that there are 2 in this picture, the first on the left and one in here that don't have red bills, and these are juveniles. But the red-billed quelea is one of the most common birds in this area of Africa, and they'd be flocks of many thousands, and they'd just be moving like a cloud of insects from one area to another. And the noise they make essentially drowns out the sound of any other bird in the area. They're so vocal. And there were lots of vultures as well of various types, the whiteback, lappet face, and this rather uncommon white-headed vulture. From the Nguma bush camp, day 11, we headed up towards Rundu. And this is a long stretch of road in the northern part of the country. And we're getting into the part of the country where there's a little bit of rain, more vegetation, less desert. And along the roadside, you would see these villages. And these villages is where the people live. There were large numbers of these strung all along the highway. But I think if you went 200 yards off the main road, you wouldn't find very much of anything. So we were headed for Hakasembe River Lodge, and this is just outside of Rundu. And when we got there, we were faced with the road closed due to flooding. So they were ready for us, and Gareth was ready for the detour because he'd been texting back and forth with the people that had organized the tour. And they sent us down the road to a boat, which took us about 20 minutes down the river to where the lodge is. And this was the approach to the lodge. Normally you would approach from the road, the other side, but this was an approach from the water side, and you got a good view of it. This is a view from our cabin, which was cabin number 1. And we're just down from the dining hall. The dining hall is in the center area. And this is a look in our room, which was rather comfortable. Mosquito nets were present in virtually all places that we stayed. And this is a sunset looking to the west, or westish. And on the right-hand bank is Angola, and on the left-hand bank is Namibia. And this is the Okavango River, or the Kavanga River, as it's also shown on maps. So this leads down to the Okavango Delta. And it's actually the 4th longest river in Africa, but it never reaches the ocean. So it's a fascinating thing where it drains down into the Okavango Delta and disappears. This was next morning. There's a pair of pygmy geese flying by. They were lots of pygmy geese flying back and forth on the river. So we were practicing taking pictures of the flying birds in the early morning light, because even though this was just an overnight stop, it's a place where you'd like to spend probably a week. It was absolutely beautiful. And then going back upriver, the striated heron and a few other birds along the shore, but the real object this day was to head on towards Botswana. This was along the roadside, a sulfur-breasted bushshrike, interesting bird with a very characteristic call. So this was our day 12 drive across, and we hit the border between Namibia and Botswana. So we're coming down into Botswana because Zero Lodge is in Botswana. We hit the border, and the first thing you have to do is you have to clear out of Namibia, and then you had to clear into Botswana. But before we could clear into Botswana, we had to go through a COVID screen. And this was the first place we'd encountered anything related to COVID on this whole trip. Not much discussion about it or anything. Very few people in any of the lodges, but here we encountered a complete temperature screen, full questionnaire. We had to provide contacts that they could get hold of us here and at home before they would allow us to go through to the Immigration and Customs. Once we got through there, it was to Dorotsky's Lodge, where we caught a boat to that had come up from Zero Lodge to pick us up, the outer boat on this group. And we headed downriver. And obviously in the river, this is the Okavango Delta, there are lots and lots of birds. And just to give you a flavor of some of them, this is the white-fronted bee-eater. There were hundreds of them, and little bee-eaters and squawko heron, cattle egrets, kingfishers. There's some malachite kingfisher, long-toed lapwings, some raptors, and of course across the bottom, the Nile crocodile. This was a big bruiser who slipped off the bank the moment we stopped to have a look. He probably would have stayed there if we'd gone zipping by, but he's probably 10 or 12 feet long. And we got to Zero Lodge. It was about a 40 to 50 minute run down the river, at probably 20, 25 knots, something like that. And this is the patio of our accommodation. And on the left is a look into the tent that we were in. And again, as I say, these are rather palatial tents and rather comfortable. On the side, there were two 8-foot sliding glass doors, and on this end, there was another 8-foot sliding glass door. If you wanted to seal it off, you could, but if you wanted to have it open, you could open it up to the air as well. They call themselves a birding paradise, and they really are. In the lower center is a vervet monkey. There were monkeys in the trees around us, and they would greet us and be on the roof and various places. And just below the balconies, outside the railings, there were hoof prints of hippopotamus that come along at nighttime. So you don't want to be wandering around at night, because you could very well run into a hippopotamus. This was the next morning. We headed out looking for Pell's fishing owl, and in the upper center is the Pell's fishing owl. This is about 4 inches bigger than our great horned owl. And in this particular photo, the owl is what they call upset or disturbed, because it has its ruff all flared out. And so it gets this very round looking head under those circumstances. And these are some of the other birds that were around: woodland kingfisher, brown firefinch, Hartlam's babbler, and others. The Hartlam's babbler is a noisy group bird that exists in groups, and the troops of them were moving through the camp all the time. You'd hear them coming and going. So this is what the bird looks like when it's not perturbed. It's got its crest or its crest feathers down. It's a very impressive bird, and it feeds entirely on fish. And there was a perch just in front of our patio where one had been seen a few days previously eating a fish in the early morning. So you can get lucky when you're there. But this is one of the few places where you can see Pell's fishing owl easily because there is a resident pair around the camp. And in the trees up above, there's also a pair of African wood owls. And I thought I'd give you an idea of what a day at Zero Lodge is like, just to let you in on a little bit of a luxury that we were treated to. This is lunch in the garden. So they service in the garden lunchtime. And behind this is Sean at the back, who's a chef and also manager and co-owner of this resort. Behind him is the dining room where you have breakfast. Well, after lunch, of course, you have a nap. And then after a nap, you're treated to afternoon tea. And there was always a fresh baked cake or some goodie of some sort. And what you have to realize is there were only 3 of us there, Gareth, Noreen, and I. And this is the spread they put out for us. So we didn't suffer. And then this afternoon, a run down into the Okavanga Delta, and this is going deeper into the Delta, looking at some of the wildlife along the river. In this particular instance, we're down where they harvest water lilies in the dry season when the river levels are considerably below what they are at the present time. Because we're in full flood at this time, the water's very high. And at the end of the day, we always stop for happy hour, or what they call sundowners, on the patio overlooking the Okavanga River and watching the sunset. And at that, we would retire to the garden, which was lit with kerosene lanterns, and that's where they would serve us dinner. And you'll notice Noreen taking a picture of dinner. They were always well presented and elegant. In the trees above us in the garden, you'd see things such as the broadbill roller, various other birds. On the right side is a jacana and the river along the riverbank. And I want to show you a series of 3 pictures that were taken in less than half a second. I was taking this picture of the jacana on the river, and my camera shoots 7 frames per second. And I had the button held down when this happened. And the next frame is this. And it was after that that we figured out that the jacana flew out of the picture and didn't catch any of that motion. And an alligator, or a Nile crocodile, lunged out of the water to try and catch the jacana. The jacana got away, the crocodile didn't get anything, and we got quite a surprise. From there, we went back up into Namibia and the Caprivi Strip area and the Mahango Game Reserve, which is large game and again lots of birds. And I'm going to move along here. This is an antelope that I didn't really know, which is the southern Lechwe. And these live in the Delta area, and they are apparently water-loving antelope and have hooves that are designed to walk in these very swampy, muddy areas. And such things as the Cape buffalo, and you see on the right-hand side of his face there, the red-billed oxpecker. And a kudu in the bush on the left, and it's a buck, and on the right, grooming baboons, and we're also for monkeys moving through. Elephants and various other things. This is a composition of some of the birds that we saw in the water in the park. The yellow-billed stork and the black heron. In this case, you can see that it's got its wings out and it's sheltering and actually feeding in the area. The yellow-billed stork and black heron worked their way across. And there's actually a YouTube video that I did of this feeding behavior, and it's posted on YouTube. Upper right, an osprey. We've seen osprey in South America locally and also in Africa. And this is a saddle-billed stork, lower right. They're quite an interesting looking bird. From there, we went into Mahangu Safari Camp. And to draw your attention to this causeway, which was man-built and fairly recently built with little corrugated stretches that allowed the water to move back and forth. Part of the reason was getting to this lodge was very difficult beforehand. And if one looks at the neighboring lodge gets their guests to and from the lodge in the wet season by dugout canoe and patio chairs. Well, the causeway actually served as a very nice place to look for birds. And one unusual one was the lesser jacana, which we saw along the side, and then the Luapula cisticola, which is a rare endemic in this particular area. There was a pair of them along this causeway. And here I'm enjoying this particular tent camp. They gave us an option to relocate to another concrete block cabin, which didn't look very interesting. It had small windows. They said it was air conditioning. Well, this tent is air conditioned as well as having opening panels, etc. And the thing I liked about this tent was this is the patio in front of it. So your view is across at the park. And we actually saw a hippopotamus across in the park area from the patio. And the next morning, this was the sunrise. So what's not to like about that? I don't know who wants a cinder block cabin. Okay, from Mahangu Safari Lodge, we headed along the Caprivi Strip, and this is a strip of land that was granted to German West Africa as access to their eastern holdings back in 1890, I believe it was. And there was a problem with this granting. They thought they'd grant the Germans access to the Zambezi River, which they did, but Victoria Falls lay between the Zambezi River and the east coast of Africa. So it was a great impediment. However, this has historically remained the way it is. One of the birds that we were looking for particularly was the racket-tailed roller. This was the last of the rollers in the Southern Africa group of rollers that we had not yet seen. And Gareth took us to an area where he said we should see it. And sure enough, we did. It was in the trees across the road from where he was looking for it, but it's close enough. And we ended up at Caprivi Matoya Lodge and campsite for 2 nights. We were looking for Shallows Turaco, but we're not able to actually see it in the end at this location. But we saw lots of other birds. And the African oriole, yellow-breasted apellis, black-crowned chagra, rattling cisticola, gray-tipped flycatcher, and yellow-fronted tinkerbird. These are just some examples. And the dotted border butterfly is an example of a butterfly. There were hundreds of butterflies of different types, but not the subject of this evening's talk. This is looking out on the Zambezi River from the patio. And if you look down in the water, in the trees around us, you'd see kingfishers and other small birds. And we got one of our better pictures of a pair of pygmy geese that were just cruising in and out of the water right in front of the patio. So it was a great place to sit with a cool drink and just spend some time. We took a river cruise along the Zambezi River, and these are some of the birds, the wattle lapwings in the upper left, these again, plover family, Allen's gallinule, lower right, the white-winged and whiskered terns, the whiskered tern with the black cap, the white-wing are the other ones, and on the upper right is a little bittern. In the center is a coppery-tailed cuckold, and this Gareth had probably a 10-minute conversation with, because he can imitate birds, and this one just sat there and talked back to him, and they talked back and forth for a good 10 minutes before we finally left. The bird didn't leave. And this is Shallow's Taraco that we were looking for. This is taken from eBird. It's not one of our pictures. We were told there were Shallow's Taraco there, and they have been seen there in the past, but what they were hearing was actually a gray go-away bird, which has a very similar call to the Shallow's Taraco. But in this case, all we saw were the gray go-away bird. So our final day was day 17, in which we crossed through 3 countries to end up in Victoria Falls. So we left Namibia, and again, going through COVID testing into Botswana, through Botswana, and then exit Botswana and into Zimbabwe. And I'm also showing you here an insert of Zambia, the Zambezi Sands down here, which is just to the west of Victoria Falls. And the reason I'm showing you that is we actually spent 4 days there after the tour was finished. So this is sunrise as we headed for the first border crossing, and we went early because we wanted to meet an expediter who was going to help Gareth get the Toyota 4-wheel drive into Zimbabwe. Each time you cross the border, there are problems and payments that have to be made. And there was an expediter to do this transfer into Zimbabwe. Along the road in Botswana, we saw these brown hornbills, female on the left, male on the right. And I don't know if everybody knows that they have incredible eyelashes. This is the male. The female also has incredible eyelashes. It's not a sex thing. And a martial eagle. This is an immature martial eagle. A mature martial eagle would have a brown head and speckles on its breast, or somewhat speckled breast. And we headed into Victoria Falls, and before we stopped anywhere, Gareth said, we've got to find a palm tree, a particular kind of palm tree. And we went looking, and we found this not very far from the falls, and as it turned out, within about 5 minutes drive of our hotel. And the reason was to find the collared palm thrush, which is an endemic that is in this area and restricted to palm trees. However, it was in the tree next door to the palm trees, not actually in the palm trees. Very interesting bird with a very characteristic call. This is our Victoria Falls Rainbow Hotel, and just some of the things that we saw around it. And I'm going to move forward to Victoria Falls. This is a look at the falls. And when we were there, with the massive amounts of water in the river and the rainfalls that they'd having, the river was just thundering, an incredible noise, and the water across the full width of the falls. In the upper left is a tropical boo-boo and a red-faced stickla upper right. The statue of David Livingstone I put in the front, the discoverer of the falls, if you want, the British explorer who reported it for the first time. And it really is quite remarkable. This is looking down into Devil's Cataract, and one of the side channels, huge amounts of water. And of course, you got to take a picture, and we were lucky to get a picture with a rainbow. It's a place you want to go with an umbrella and poncho and rain gear. We just got a little wet. We had our umbrellas, but people were getting soaked in there. So this is a summary of what we saw on the trip. 345 bird species, 32 mammals, 10 reptiles, and 60 new lifers for our life list. Total, we've seen 581 of the 962 that are listed in the Southern Africa Bird Book. So that was the tour. And I'm going to just give you a touch of Zambezi Sands, just to finish off. One of Noreen's bucket list items was to go paddling in the Zambezi River, and this was at Zambezi Safari Lodges. We spent 4 days, and they looked after us very well. treated us well. And again, glamping, because we even had a plunge pool on our patio. And time for sundial, call it the end. That's it.
Turn it on.
If people have any questions,
If anybody's left.
if anybody's left.
I'm still here.
We're all still here.
I was muted. It's Vicky speaking. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you. I've been to Namibia, but certainly didn't see what you saw in terms of the bird life. That was wonderful.
Well, thank you.
I just want to say how much I enjoyed it, and thank you very much. It was just thoroughly wonderful memories for me.
Okay, I'm going to get out of here.
It was outstanding. Thank you. So much in it.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. Good night, everybody. I've got to
Good
head
night,
off.
everybody. I
Kept it
enjoyed
all up.
Yeah.
Well, I sure enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Very
You're
good. Thank
welcome.
you.
I'll be watching the recording again.
David, a question. This is Glenn.
Yes, Glenn.
How did you hook up with that guide? He sounds pretty special.
Well, he's actually the guide that we went through South Africa with last year. So, and we will use him again because has an incredible knowledge of the birds, the wildlife. He used to be in game park as a game warden, and for that reason, he has all the wildlife tagged, and he knows most of their calls and can imitate an awful lot of birds.
Yeah.
And knows their habitat and their behaviors, so is very good at picking them up.
He was just, when we booked with the Rockjumper Tours, he was just assigned to us. So we didn't know ahead of time. But because we got along so well with him, we asked if he would do a private tour with us. Like we still book through Rockjumper, but they have a way you can ask for private tours as well.
I did.
And that really makes it special. That's good that you found him.
Yeah.
So when this COVID thing is over, we're hoping to go to see the lemurs
Madagascar,
Oh my God.
with him.
because he runs tours to Madagascar.
That's
He's guided tours to Madagascar and also Ethiopia. So we probably go Ethiopia, Kenya, and then Madagascar.
So pray for a vaccine.
Yeah.
We're looking forward to the photo show.
Right.
Good night, everyone.
Okay. Good night.
Fantastic.
Night.
Yeah.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful pictures.
Thanks, David, Noreen. That was really good. Really good.
Good.
Fantastic. Thank you. Fantastic.
Going to be the last.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Night.
Good night.
Turn ourselves off.
Good night. Good night. Thank you, David, Noreen.